Yesterday I was watching my two 14-inch CRT display. One is a Sony Trinitron PVM, the other one is a Sony Trinitron Consumer CRT TV. And I asked myself, well, a question, why it actually look that sharp on the PVM? So I'm pretty sure you heard the term television lines, TVL. This is a measure of CRT's horizontal resolution, defined by the maximum number of distinct vertical lines the screen can resolve within the width equal to its height. Simply put, a higher TVL number indicates a sharper display capable of rendering much finer details. The reason, by the way, that it's multiplied is because it makes the measurement independent of the screen shape, of the aspect ratio. So if a TVL were measured across the entire width of the screen, a wider monitor, like maybe 16:9 aspect ratio, would automatically have a higher number than a square monitor, just because it is wider. I mean, let's say 4:3, not because it's the picture is actually sharper. In other words, it measured the density. So when you hear the term 350 TVL, this means that the monitor can resolve a 300 distinctive vertical line across the width equal to the screen's height. Now, in this case, you can see me playing 240p content coming from the Super Famicom console, SNES. So it's important to distinguish between the horizontal resolution measured by the TVL, then the vertical resolution when we play retro games that are determined by the signal, like 240 lines, for example. So when we talk about 600 TVL monitor, like the PVM that I have, it doesn't draw more scan lines than a 350 TVL monitor. It draws the same number of scan lines, 240, but it draws them with much finer precision and separation. I'm going to show you a simulation in a moment, but it's important to understand that the visual texture of a 600 TVL, especially on a 14-inch monitor via RGB, is characterized by extreme segmentation, because the electron beam is focused on a very fine point to achieve a 600 line resolution. So in other words, what it does, it illuminates a very narrow horizontal strip of phosphors for each scan line. And of course, there's a cross between in this case, the Sony Trinitron, between the vertical lines and the horizontal lines that are actually drawn. Now, I'm going to show you a comparison. I think mine is 350, not 100% sure, I'm just saying, but the PVM I checked, it's 600 TVL. And you can actually see it here. This is a macro shot of the 60 TVL my Sony PVM Trinitron. Now, I also want to add that shadow mask and slot mask cap the TVL because they break luminance into discrete dots or slots. They're causing kind of fine black-white detail to lose contrast once it approaches the mask pitch. Now on Aperture grille Trinitron CRTs, the TVL is limited mainly by the beam focus, vertical phosphor stripe pitch, and signal bandwidth, not by the dot or slot mask. So because the phosphors form continuous vertical lines, luminous detail is preserved far better than on dot or slot mask, but the stripe spacing still sets the ultimate ceiling. Now I just want to add, for example, if a PVM is rated for 600 TVL and you read before that around they give approximate 60 TVL in the center, it might have, for example, like maybe between 800 to 900 physical wires across the full width of the screen. And this extra hardware is necessary because the electron beam doesn't always align perfectly with a single wire. If you had exactly like 600 wires for 600 lines, you would get a vibrating messy image, also called an interference pattern. So even with, let's say, 600 dedicated wires for 600 lines, interference pattern can appear, well, for different reasons. For example, a beam width is not infinitely thin, so it can spill into neighboring lines. Again, this is because the beam is not a perfect square, it usually has a Gaussian distribution. So it can actually overlap with the adjacent lines phosphor or pixel area and creates a lack of sharpness and can lead to unintended brightness summation where those two lines meet together. Phosphor grain size and shadow mask interaction can lead to moire and stripe patterns. There's also the electromagnetic crosstalk between wires that adds kind of subtle distortions, and the timing and synchronization issues that can also occur that lead to kind of slight vertical misalignment that also visible as patterns. So even if you had like 1000 wires, for example, and you have a low-end Electron GAM, and you know, basically what happens, it will only give you, for example, like 300 TVL because the beam is too fat, too thick, and splashes across multiple wires at once. Whether on a high-end one, like one you find on PVMs and BVMs, a sharp electron gun hitting those 1000 wires can give you, let's say, 800 TVL because it can hit 1 or 2 wires very precisely without splashing onto the neighbors. This is, by the way, why focus and convergence are so important, because it's much harder for the magnets in the TV to keep the 3 beams for red, green, and blue perfectly aligned in the corners than in the middle. So in the middle, for example, the beams can be even perfectly converged and stack on top of each other perfectly, while in the corners, for example, the beams often drifts apart slightly. So if they aren't perfectly stacked, you lose detail, which effectively lowers your TVL in those areas. Right, this is why it makes sense, you know, when you read something like that, the Trinitron 2 provides for these particular ones high resolution picture. Horizontal resolution is more than 600 TV lines at the center of the picture. Now, of course, high-end monitors like BVMs add a special dynamic focus circuits to try to keep the beam tiny even in the corners, which is another reason why they were so much more expensive than consumer CRTs. It's not just that, but this is just one part of it. So you can see comparison, again, around 600 TVL for the PVM on the left compared to consumer TV, both Sony Trinitron, around 350 TVL of the consumer CRT on the right side. For the PVM, you can see that the wires are extremely thin and pegged very close together, also known as fine pitch. This allows for more wires across the screen, which is how they achieve high TVL. With the consumer TV, the wires are significantly thicker and spaced even further apart, also known as coarse pitch. But it wasn't, you know, just to save money when it comes to consumer CRT. It was actually a deliberate choice for the living room because of, well, first of all, brightness, because thicker phosphor stripes provide more surface area for the electron beam to hit, so this makes the TV much brighter, which was necessary for rooms with windows and sunlight. And it also helped hiding the flicker, because in the 80s and the 90s everyone watched NTSC 480i on the TV, so on a sharp PVM this flicker of NTSC video is very annoying. So on a consumer TV, the thicker wires and, well, fatter electron beam also cause the lines to bleed together slightly, naturally smoothing out the flicker. Also, the aperture grid on the PVM on the Trinitron, for example, is much narrower and has more frequent vertical lines. And this is, of course, leads to higher TVL count, but also results in significantly sharper image with more visible black gaps between scan lines. So essentially the PVM mask, just put in quotation, is a high resolution filter, whether the consumer version has wider slot that creates softer blended picture. Now I also want to talk about the blur a bit more in depth so you can understand that fully. So we talk about, again, the light on the consumer CRT kind of more bleeding toward adjacent areas. So it leads to kind of, I don't know, like soft sharpness. Basically the image is sharp enough to see detail clearly. It's not blurry like composite video, for example. In this case we see it with CRTGB. But you can definitely see that on the right of the consumer TV, the harsh kind of stir stab, the diagonal lines, the edges of the pixel are naturally anti-aliased by the beam's profile. We're going to talk about this in a moment. I'm going to illustrate this, but you can see that on the left is sharper. I think it's even sharper than what you see here because, again, it was captured with the camera and a bit upscale, so it's not perfect. Now for flat color art, like you see here, for example, leads to the solid blocks of color and strong black outlines pop very well on a sharp monitor. And therefore the cartoon look is kind of enhanced by the sharp separation of pixels. But at the same time, you know, everything like that is more Pentaroid-like Chrono Trigger or Metal Slug, for example. These games feature intricate shading and gradients. So on a 350 TVL set, for example, the shading looks smoother and more hand-painted, whether on a 600 TVL set, for example, like my PVM, the shading can look like distinct bands of color. Now, do hear arguments for both sides regarding 480i, for example, like for example in the early 3D area, like PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, early 3D console lacked sub-pixel precision, so it causes polygons to kind of shimmer or jitter as they move. So a 600 TVL monitor, for example, accentuates this jitter because every edge is razor sharp. So the image can feel unstable, even on the fake ones, like you see here, like Mario Kart. Now I also want to talk about what leads to this blurring. It's actually quite interesting. So this kind of simulation will try to explain to you what the difference is between, again, the relation between the TVL and what we see in terms of sharpness, and also on the diagonal jagged that I showed you earlier. So let's do an analogy. So if you think of an electron beam inside the CRT like a car driving high speed, so in a retro game, a diagonal line is made of blocks, of pixels. So it's arranged like a stairs, as you can see here. So this creates a sharp jagged corners, also known as jaggies. So as the beam starts moving across the screen, of course, it changes color. Let's say that the console now decided to stop painting white and start painting black right after. So it can create the edge of a pixel. Now, if you think of a low TVL monitor like a heavy truck, it can stop instantly. So when it needs to stop, the beam's voltage takes a split second to drop down. So because it can stop instantly, the white color kind of drifts or smears slightly into the black area next to it. So I'm going to show this in a moment clearer. You can see it now. So the slight smear actually fills in the sharp, ugly corners of the pixel stir. So it acts kind of like a natural hardware-based smoothing, also known as anti-aliasing. So making the game look softer and more organic rather than blocky. Now there is a correlation between the low TVL and also sometimes the cheapness or simplicity of the internal electronics. So think about video signal like water flowing through a pipe. So a high TVL, like for example the one that I have, the Sony PVM, these have a wide pipe or high bandwidth. So if the console, for example, say like something like switch from white to black, the electronics can move that massive change in voltage almost instantly. Now, on a consumer TV, to save money, consumer TVs were built with more skinnier pipes, low bandwidth. So they literally cannot physically move enough electrical current fast enough to make a sharp cliff in voltage. So in yellow, you can see the cliff represents how much time it takes to actually shift between one color to the other. And at the bottom, you can see that the result is a shift from black to white, but in between there's different shades of gray. And the thing is that with electronics, you can't just go from 1 volt to 50 volts in 0 seconds. It takes time for the electrons to build up. So on a high-end monitor, it might take, let's say, 2 nanoseconds to switch. It's kind of a sharp cliff. Whether on consumer Sony TV, for example, it might take, let's say, 20 nanoseconds to switch, which kind of causes a more, like a hill. You can see it right now. Now, because the electron beam is constantly moving across the screen at a massive speed, those extra 8 nanoseconds extra between the two that I just mentioned, what's also called the switching time, translate into physical distance on the screen. So instead of a light cutting off exactly at the edge of the pixel, it fades out while the beam is still traveling. So that fades out is the blur you see on the phosphors. Now on top of that, on Pro Monitor, the electron beam is focused into a tiny sharp needle point, whether on consumer TV is thicker. So even if the electronics could switch off instantly, the brush itself is so wide that it's already touching the next black area before the center of the beam has even finished the white area. So this creates a physical overlap that blurs the image. Now theoretically, Sony could have put high bandwidth electronics in every TV, but they didn't. Well, because first of all, the cost, so first transistors and high quality focus magnets were expensive. And second, in the 90s, most people were watching noisy cables or VHS, so a sharp TV would show all the ugly static and grain. A low TVL TV naturally smoothed out the noise, making the picture look cleaner, in quotation, to the average person. So yeah, so many things can actually affect this, like phosphor bloom, beam spot size, video bandwidth, convergence error, focus voltage, signal interference, aperture grill or shadow max pitch, component aging, and so on. Now there's also the regional standard, for example NTSC in USA and Japan, also called a fast standard. It has a smoother motion, 60 Hz, but lower detail, 240p. Whether PAL in Europe, for example, is the sharp standard. It has more detail, 288p, but slower motion, 50 Hz. So basically there are broadcast rules that tell the Electron gun how many lines to draw and how fast to draw them. But it's important to note that it does not change the physical TVL rating of the monitor, but it changes how much of that resolution is actually used. So on NTSC 240p, the lines are spread further apart. You see thicker black gaps between the glowing scan lines. Because of the lines are fewer, the image looks punchier but less dense. And in PAL, for example, the lines are packed tighter together, so you see thinner black gaps like you see here. And this is even with composite. So because you are using more vertical lines, the image looks filled in and more detailed. So you might be asking, well, the gaps or the fill-ins, well, basically developers made game for NTSC 240 lines. So when they put it on a PAL TV, which expect 280 lines, they didn't add more graphics, so they just left the extra 408 lines either empty or fill it up. I explain it more in detail in a future video. But this also affects the results you are actually seeing. Anyway, there are going to be more videos about this, specifically when you jump deeper into the rabbit hole. Yeah, very interesting stuff, and I share as I go. So if you enjoyed this one, you find this one interesting, or if you have anything to add, or if you find even inaccuracy or mistakes, let me know in the comment section below, and consider also subscribing to my channel. More interesting videos are coming. Stay tuned.